Taanis, Daf Yudam and Aleph, the Mishnah talks about Shol and Esek Shamim. We ask for rain. When do we ask for rain? This is what we refer to as V'sein Tal U'Matra Levracha. It's actually an unfortunate phrase that we use. We say V'sein Tal U'Matra. We don't say anything. We ask Hashem to please give us rain because our life depends on it. But we call it saying V'sein Tal U'Matra. The Mishnah calls it Shol and Esek Shamim. From when do we begin saying it? Begimel b'Mar Cheshvan, the third day of Mar Cheshvan. Rabbi Kollel Amar b'Shiva Bo, from the seventh day of Mar Cheshvan. Tesvav Yom Achar Chag, 15 days after Sukkot. Why? Kadesh Yagia Akron Shabbat Yisrael and Har Pras, to give people time to go home from Aliyah L'Regel when they were in Yerushalayim at the Beis HaMikdash. The Ran says, even though today we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, people still went to Yerushalayim. The halacha remained, even after the Churban, the halacha still remained of enough, giving them enough time to get back after Sukkot. So the halacha remains, according to Rabbi Gamliel, B'Shiva Bo, the seventh day of Mar Cheshvan. The Gemara says, Am Rabbi Elazar, halacha Rabbi Gamliel, we pass like Rabbi Gamliel, that it is the seventh day of Mar Cheshvan and not the third. This is all Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara says, Chananya Omer Uvagola, in the Gola, in Bavel, Ad Shishim B'Tkufa. The day is not the seventh day of Mar Cheshvan, the day is the 60 days after the Tkufa. The Tkufa is the autumnal, the September equinox. More about that later. The Gemara only tells us the day for Eretz Yisrael and for Bavel, for Gola. What about the rest of the world, other countries? So the Rosh had a great deal of trouble with this. The Rosh, briefly in his Psakim and at much greater length in the Tshuva, the Rosh was very perplexed by the fact that in his time in Ashkenaz, the dominant minhag was that they followed the rule of Gola, they followed the rule of waiting until 60 days after the Tkufa. He says, we need rain much earlier. In Bavel was a valley, Bavel was low down, it had lots of water, runoff from the mountains. Bavel, maybe they planted late, but we clearly need rain much earlier, he says. We plant crops early. If the water doesn't come, if rain doesn't come, birds and rats will eat the seeds. We definitely need rain much earlier. He doesn't understand why we don't follow the minhag of Eretz Yisrael. It's not a machlokas. He says, yes, Talmud Bavli is the ikar for us. We follow the Talmud Bavli when the Chacham of Bavel disagree with the Chacham of Eretz Yisrael. This is not a machlokas, he says. This just depends on agricultural conditions, on rain conditions, on conditions of planting. So it would make much more sense, he says, in the culture that he knew, the agricultural culture that he knew, it would make much more sense to ask for rain much earlier. He doesn't understand why the minhag was not like that. He mentions that in Provence they did actually follow minhag Eretz Yisrael. Nevertheless, the minhag is not like the Rosh. Even in his time, certainly by the time of the Shulchan Aruch and later Achronim, the minhag outside Eretz Yisrael is to be Shol and Esek Shamim 60 days after the Tkufa, not, according to Eretz Yisrael, on the 7th of Mar Cheshvan. The Rambam actually also implies that it isn't really fixed for the rest of the world. The Rambam says, he uses different phrasing in his commentary to the Mishnah and the Yad, but in both of them he seems to imply that it really depends on each place what its agricultural needs are, that in Eretz Yisrael or similar places it's 7th of Mar Cheshvan. In Bavel and similar places it would be 60 days after the Tkufa. He doesn't say it's a general rule that everyone follows Bavel, but again, the minhag is, however that became the minhag is that we consider ourselves Bnei Bavel in some sense. We follow the minhag of Bavel, despite the fact that that may not align with our agricultural needs. So we follow the rule that we say 60 days, Acharet, 60 days following the Tkufa, following the autumnal equinox. The end of the Gemara brings a question, a debate between Rav and Shmuel. The 60th day itself, is that Kilafnei Shishim or Kilachar Shishim? The 60th day itself, is that the last day that you don't say V'sein Tal U'Matra Levracha, or the first day that you do? We paskin, Rav Papa says, Hilchsa Yom Shishim Kilachar Shishim, on the 60th day, you already begin to say V'sein Tal U'Matra Levracha. Now, the Rosh brings the shita of the Aviha Ezri. Aviha Ezri says it's not calendar days like we have, whether Jewish calendar or non-Jewish calendar. It doesn't work by calendar days. You count 60 24-hour periods from the Tkufa. The Tkufa is a moment, and more about that soon. The Tkufa is a moment, an astronomical or a calendrical moment in time. You count 60 24-hour periods from when the Tkufa falls in a given year. Any tefillah that is said before that moment, that is said before that moment, you don't say V'sein Tal U'Matra yet. After that moment, you do. But the Rosh says that's not the minhag. Later poskim, the Shulchan Aruch, later poskim also say it's not the minhag. Rather, we calculate when the Tkufa is. We count forward 60 days, Neis La'es. That day becomes the first day on which you say V'sein Tal U'Matra Levracha, even on those tefillas that you daven before the Tkufa actually takes place. The Tkufa never takes place immediately at the beginning of the day, so Marav of the night before is typically davened before the moment of the Tkufa, but it doesn't matter. We just establish the day on which you begin saying V'sein Talamatul Levracha based on the Tkufa, and that entire day from the night before, we already begin saying V'sein Talamatul Levracha. The Achronim bring the Pri Chadash, who actually says that b'diavad, if a person forgot to say V'sein Talamatar, we can bring up the Shita of the Avi HaEzri and say that you don't have to go back because Avi HaEzri held until the actual Tkufa occurs, you don't need to say V'sein Talamatul Levracha. The Halacha brings that many Achronim disagree. Many Achronim say the Rav is rejected Mehalacha. The Halacha says the entire day on which the 60 days after the Tkufa falls out, the entire day needs V'sein Talamatul Levracha. Even the first Tefillah, even Marav of that day. Chakras can also fall out before the Tkufa. If the Tkufa falls out late in the day, then even Chakras might be before the Tkufa. It doesn't matter. We say that from the day on which the Tkufa begins, count 60 days forward, that entire day, that day number 60, needs V'sein Talamatul Levracha, needs She'elas Kshamim, and it's Ma'akev. If a person forgot, he has to daven again, because that's the day in which you have to say V'sein Talamatul Levracha. Now, what exactly is the Tkufa? The Tkufa is the autumnal equinox, sometimes referred to as the September equinox. Equinox we can define in a variety of ways. It's an astronomical point in time, an astronomical day. Equinox comes from the old Latin words that means equal night, the day on which the night is equal to the day. It happens twice a year, the autumnal equinox and the spring equinox. It's also the day the sun rises in the morning on the east, but it rises sometimes more northward, sometimes more southward. On the equinox, the sun rises equidistant between its most northern point and its most southern point. It rises halfway between the north and the south. The most precise, standard, modern astronomical definition of the equinox, it is the day on which the sun crosses the plane of the equator. If you took the equator, put a piece of paper through it, put a plane through it and extended that plane out, when the sun crosses that plane, alternatively, when somebody standing on the equator would see the sun due overhead at the zenith, that's the day of the equinox. It's traditionally the time when we say that the fall begins or the spring begins, but it's an astronomical point, an astronomical day, a day that has certain astronomical significance, so we take that day as the Tkufa. Tkufa is relevant, as we'll discuss shortly, in other areas of halacha. In this case, we calculate 60 days forward from the Tkufa. On that day, even the night before, that's the day on which we begin saying V'sein Talamatul Levracha. So we know that in our Siddurim it says that you begin saying V'sein Talamatul Levracha on December 4th, or December 5th, the year preceding a leap year. Very unusual, of course, to have a halacha which is established based on a secular date. And why should it matter? Why should it matter if it's a leap year or not a leap year? In particular, I was always perplexed. Why should we care if next year is a leap year? If anything, I would have thought maybe we should depend on when the previous year was a leap year. Why does the halacha depend on next year was a leap year? So the answers to these questions are all based on what we've just seen. We follow the opinion that you begin saying V'sein Talamatul Levracha 60 days after the Tkufa, on the 60th day after the day on which the Tkufa falls. The Tkufa is an astronomical event. Therefore, it depends on the solar. It's a solar event. It has to do with where the sun appears in its path through the sky. So certainly that is based on the solar calendar, not the lunar calendar. So it's certainly not going to be fixed in terms of our normal calendar, which is a lunar calendar. Instead, it occurs on a more or less fixed day during the solar calendar because since it is a solar event, it remains more or less constant based on the solar calendar. Now, why does it shift from the 4th to the 5th? So the answer is, how long is a solar year? And when do the Tkufas occur? So the Gemara quotes actually at Shmuel. Shmuel explains to us what is called the Tkufa Shmuel, the length of the solar year and the length of each of the 4 Tkufas. There are 4 Tkufas, 2 equinoxes, the autumnal and the spring, and 2 solstices, the winter and the summer, the days on which the day is very long and the night is very short, and vice versa. These are the 4 points that divide the solar year into 4 quarters. Shmuel tells us in the context of Birkas Hachama that the solar year is exactly 365 and a quarter days long, 365 and 6 hours long, and the Tkufas are each a quarter of that. Shmuel says, therefore, so Birkas Hachama, that's why we make Birkas Hachama once every 28 years, because if the sun starts in a certain point, when the year is over, when the solar year of 365 and a quarter is over, the sun is now 6 hours further in its path. After 4 years, the sun moves 4 6-hour periods. That's a full day, so it's 1 day further in the week. And after seven 4-year periods, each 4-year period, the sun moves forward 1 day in the week. By the end of 7 4-year periods, the sun has moved forward seven quarter-day periods, which is a full week, and it's back to where it started. So according to Tkufa Shmuel, the sun has a cycle of 28 years. The sun returns to its initial position every 28 years. That's why we make Birkas Hachama. The law of saying V'sein Talamat L'Vracha of She'elas Kshamim follows the Tkufa of Shmuel. It follows the idea that the solar year is considered to be exactly 365 and a quarter days long. Therefore, the Tkufa of each year occurs 6 hours later into the day than it did in the previous year, because the year ended 6 hours later. So the Tkufa, the autumnal Tkufa this year is going to be 6 hours later than it was last year. So when we calculate when to say V'sein Talamat L'Vracha, which is based on 60 days after the Tkufa, so every year the Tkufa, which is the starting point, moves 6 hours. So if the year is exactly 365 days long, then every 4 years it would move 1 day ahead, because after 4 6-hour periods, the Tkufa is now falling 1 day later in a 365-day cycle. So every 4 years we would have to move the day of V'sein Talamat L'Vracha 1 day further. And if we would work with a simplistic solar calendar of exactly 365 days, it would keep moving along the calendar. Every 4 years it would be 1 day later in the calendar. So if you would work with a simplistic calendar of 365 days in a year, we would have to move the same Talamat 1 day forward every 4 years based on that calendar. But the calendar, of course, is not that simple. They also know the Gregorian, the Julian calendar Christians made is also based on understanding that the year is more than 365 days long, that the solar year is actually 365 and a quarter or close to a quarter days long. That's why they add leap years roughly every 4 years to bring their version of the solar calendar in line with the true solar calendar, which is about 365 and a quarter days. Therefore, as long as there are no leap years, when years go by, when 4 years go by and there's no leap years, we advance 1 day forward in the calendar, because after 4 quarter year advancements of the Tkufa, it goes a day later. On the other hand, when they add a leap year, then it drops back 1 day, because now the year is 1 day longer. So that means the Tkufa of the following year goes back 1 day. So the truth is, when we move it forward in the year before the leap year, it's not because next year is a leap year. After any 4 years, after a 4 year period, we have to move it forward 1 day, and the year of the leap year, the next year is when we actually drop it back 1 day. It actually depends on, it's something of a coincidence that it happens to work out this way. Had the Shmuel's Tkufa been out of sync by 1 more year with the Gregorian and Julian calendars, we would have gone December 4th, then December 5th, and then drop back to the 4th. The point is, you go forward once every 4 years, and you go backward whenever there's a leap year, because adding a leap year moves the next year of the Tkufa backward 1 day in the calendar, but every 4 years it goes 1 day forward, so it's a constant push and pull. So in the long run, it just goes back and forth between the 4th and the 5th. It wasn't always this way. There's nothing magical about the 4th and the 5th. Before they had the Gregorian calendar, they had the Julian calendar, which was off, and it was a different system. If you look into the Beis Yosef, he brings from the Avudram, one of the Rishonim, that the days involved were the 22nd and 23rd of November. Today it's December 4th and 5th. But the point is that because the cheshbon of the tkufa, because Shmuel's calculation of the tkufa is based on a year that has 6 extra hours beyond an even number of days, so every 4 years the day moves 1 day forward, and every time the calendar that you're working with, the calendar that you're writing days of, which is in our case is the Gregorian calendar, every year they had a leap year, it goes back 1 day. So that goes back and forth. That goes back and forth more or less indefinitely, not quite indefinitely as we'll discuss soon, but that goes back more or less indefinitely, and that's how we get to December 4th and December 5th. Now the year is not actually 365 and a quarter days. The year is actually a little bit less than that. The solar year is actually 365 days. Instead of 6 hours, not quite 6 hours, it's actually 5 hours, 48 minutes, and some seconds. And the truth is, in our Masorah we also have a cheshbon that is not exactly that, but it's close to that. That is called the Tkufa of Rabbi bar Ava. In Shas, the only Tkufa that we have is the Tkufa of Shmuel. That is the even, simple 365 days and a quarter year in Tkufa. But there's also something called Tkufa of Rabbi bar Ava. It's not in Shas. It comes up in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. It comes up in the Rambam, who is quoting based off an earlier work of Rabbi Avram ben Rabbi Chia Hanasi, a leading early Jewish astronomer. They quote a brisa of Rabbi bar Ava. We don't know what happened to it exactly, but Rabbi bar Ava had a tkufa which is more complicated and somewhat more precise. Instead of saying 365 days and 6 hours for a solar year, he also gave a figure of 5 hours. He gave a figure of 5 hours and 55 minutes and some seconds. It's not quite the modern astronomical number of 48 minutes, but it was closer than the tkufa of Shmuel. And Rabbi bar Ava's tkufa is not used for V'sein Talamat L'Vracha. It's not used for Birkas Hachama. What it is used for is something even more important. It's used for our entire calendar. Our entire calendar of leap years, the way we reconcile the solar calendar with the lunar calendar, the cycle of 7 leap years every 19 years, that is all based on the Tkufa of Ravad Barava. It works out perfectly, it works out amazingly precise that after a 19-year cycle, the solar year, as measured by Ravad Barava as 365 days, 5 hours, 55 minutes, and change, is exactly equal to 19 lunar years with the Chad She'Ha'ibur. That's the cheshbon we use for the calendar that determines when all of our Yom Tovim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, all the Yom Tovim are. There we use the cheshbon of Adam Barava, despite the fact that it's not mentioned in Shas. That's the cheshbon that we have always used for the calendar, for the Jewish calendar that we use. The Rambam in Kiddush HaChodesh brings both the tkufos of Shmuel and Rabbi Adam Barava. He says that the ancient Greeks had a machlokas, Ar Chachamim too had a machlokas. He doesn't bring names, but the machlokas, one of them is the Shita of Shmuel, one of them is the Shita of Ravad Barava. He has actually an entire parak going through how the cheshbon works out according to Shmuel, another parak of how it works out according to Ravad Barava. The Rambam concludes by telling us that the cheshbon of Ravad Barava is more precise and more accurate and closer to the emes. He implies it's not exactly the emes, which we know it's not. The emes is a few minutes less, but he says that the Ravad Barava is more accurate and more precise, and presumably that's why we use it for the calendar. But he doesn't completely disregard the cheshbon of Shmuel. He says we have Shmuel, we have Ravad Barava. Now, for some reason, for V'sein Talamatra Levracha, it has become established halacha that we use the simpler tkufa of Shmuel, of working with tkufas that fall exactly 6 hours apart. The Gemara in Eruvin says, according to Shmuel, the tkufa 1 year is going to be 3 hours into the day, the next year, 6 hours later, 9 hours into the day, the next year, 6 hours after that, the next year, 6 hours after that. It all works out very simply. They're even numbers, 3, 6, 3, 6, 3 plus 6 is 9, and then 3 hours into the day, and then 6 more hours, first the night, then the day. It all works out very simply and easily, and that's the cheshbon we use for the same Talamar Levracha. Why don't we use the more accurate tkufa of Ravad Barava, especially if we use it for other purposes like the calendar? So which is it? Do we accept Shmuel? Do we accept Ravad Barava? Are they really arguing? If so, why don't we pick the right one? This question is discussed by various achronim. The Moshe Feinstein had a tshuva where somebody thought what we did is incorrect. We should really calculate our tkufa and the same Talamar Levracha based on the more accurate tkufa of Ravad Barava. We see it's more accurate. We use it for the calendar. We use it for important things like Yom Tovim and so on. Moshe has a very sharp reprimand to this person. He says, who do you think you are? We've been doing this for centuries. All of Kollel Yisrael has been doing this. It's always been done this way. You can't possibly think you know better than everyone else. Clearly we're doing it the right way. As to why, if we really accept that Ravad Barava also has a place in halacha, and certain things are calculated based on Ravad Barava, so why is the tkufa calculated based on Shmuel? This question was first raised by the Masas Binyamin 400 years ago. And he raises the question, he says, we're inconsistent. We seem to be inconsistent because for certain purposes like Brich Zachama and V'sein Talamater, we use Tkufa Shmuel. For the main calendar, we use Ravad Barava. He says, yeah, it's inconsistent, but halacha works like that. Halacha decided to use Shmuel for one and Ravad Barava for another. Moshe also says roughly the same thing. He says, if you look at the Rambam, as we mentioned earlier, the Rambam implies that neither one is absolutely correct or absolutely incorrect. He says Ravad Barava is more precise, and we use it for the calendar, but he doesn't completely reject Shmuel. He spends an entire parak discussing Shmuel's tkufa and how you would calculate based on it. Later he goes back, after discussing Ravad Barava and saying it's more accurate, he brings both tkufas again. So Moshe says, you see, Allah has a place for both tkufas. And as various Jewish thinkers have said, Chazal knew that Shmuel's tkufa was not accurate. Shmuel didn't think his tkufa was 100% accurate. Shmuel knew that there were more precise calculations available. Ravad Barava is actually very close to something called the Ptolemaic calculation, but it's also not 100% precise. And they knew that. They knew that Shmuel wasn't most accurate. But for certain purposes, the Chachamim felt, the halacha feels, that a more or less approximate, a coarser approximation is fine. We're talking about saying V'sein Talamar Levracha. There's nothing magical about that day. It's just a general thing that by then, generally in Bavel, other parts of the world, generally you need rain. You need rain by then. There's nothing magical about that day. So they picked a number, and they picked a number based on Shmuel's tkufa, which was relatively easy to calculate. Even today, it's still pretty easy. You don't have a long set of complicated instructions. It's just December 4th and December 5th, whether it's before a leap year or after a leap year, and so on. And they used it because it was simple. But for the calendar years, which is maybe more important, or maybe the fact that Ravad Barava fits so nicely into the 19-year cycle, for that they chose to use the tkufa of Ravad Barava. But for V'sein Talamater, we use the tkufa of Shmuel, and that's why, again, every 4 years it moves 1 day forward, but every leap year moves 1 day back, and that's why it shifts back and forth between the 4th and the 5th. Now this would be true indefinitely as long as the leap year rule was simple. As long as the leap year occurred every 4 years, this would all work out. The problem is, again, because of Avada Barava, because the day is not exactly 365 and a quarter days, and those who constructed the Gregorian calendar knew that too. That's why they made a much more complicated system of leap years. They said every 4th year is a leap year, except for century years, years ending in 100, and exception to an exception, except those centuries that are divisible by 400. So every 4 years is a leap year, but when we hit 2100, there will not be a leap year. When we hit 2400 again, then there will. So by the time we hit the year 2100, then again, the same Talmud will have advanced to the 5th, and there will not be a leap year, so it will not drop back. And at that point, the same Talmud will stop being the 4th and the 5th. It will have moved forward, and it will be the 5th and the 6th, and so on. Eventually, either way, forgetting the calendar, either way, the same Talmud is out of sync with astronomy. So eventually, the same Talmud will get the same Talmud, which is based on a longer year than actually exists by a few minutes in tens of thousands of years, will eventually progress throughout the year. It'll end up Pesach time and Shavuos time and so on. Poskim say that by then we hope that the Mashiach will have arrived and we'll be able to redesign the rules in a way that will bring it once more back to the right time.